because I'll do it. All right. As we begin this morning, let's jump right into our memory verse. Only a couple more weeks left of Hebrews memory verses at all. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. This is, I know, the longest of the verses that we gave you. The hardest one to remember. It feels like it has more consonants or more syllables or just more words. I'm not really sure. But let's read this together. It's an important verse, and so it's one that we want to work on. Hebrews 11:13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. So there's a lot there. I especially love that last part. They were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. We sing the song, "This world is not my home. I'm just passing through." That song just encapsulates that same kind of thought. So you're already in the book of Hebrews, or hopefully you are near the book of Hebrews. We want to go to chapter 11 this morning. Hebrews chapter 11. On the surface, this is going to sound like, when we read it, that there is a second person that gets two entries. But really, this entry is about his parents. It's not about him. And so it doesn't really count. Abraham stands alone as being the only person to get two mentions in this chapter, at least two entries. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23, we find our next stop on this tour through the Faith Hall of Fame simply says this: by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. Now, you say, it says it's Moses. That has nothing to do with Moses. Can we agree on that? If you are a newborn, you can't hide. Right? You get this? Everything that happened in this verse was Moses' parents, wasn't it? Do you see that? This is yes, this is no, this is like, I don't know. And this means I'm gone, I'm sleeping. Okay. So we can agree, I think, as we look at this, is really not Moses, though it mentions Moses. This really has everything to do with Moses' parents. So let me have you jump back to the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 1, and the first part of 2 is kind of where we'll hit this morning. And then we will come back to Hebrews chapter 11, so don't lose your places there. Exodus chapter 1. Now, there is some background to this particular story, some background to where we're going, because when we left last week, the children of Israel, Jacob was just moving his family from the land of Canaan down to the land of Egypt. Joseph was basically running the place. Pharaoh was still the boss. He was still the king. He was still the Pharaoh, and everybody knew that. But Joseph was administrating his kingdom for him, and they were in the midst of at least regional famine that was incredibly intense. And they had several more years of this to go. Jacob moved his family down to the land of Goshen. Now, Goshen is located in the Nile River Delta. I would draw you a picture, but I have nothing to draw it with here. And really, my pictures are not that informative when I draw them. So if you can look at it in a map, you can see the Nile River is the only major river on the earth. This is your good Trivial Pursuit information. It's the only major river on the earth that flows south to north. And so there's something worth knowing. It does flow backwards from the way that we typically think of it. So when you talk about Upper Egypt, that's actually in the south, and when you talk about Lower Egypt, it's actually in the north, because it's relative to the direction of the Nile, not the place of Egypt on the map. But the land of Goshen was located in Lower Egypt, right along the Nile River Delta, where the Nile breaks into several parts and begins to meander its way into the Mediterranean Sea. Because of its location, the Nile River Delta is among the most fertile areas, especially historically, in Egypt. It's just where it was all well watered, because there was just all of these snaking finger-like riverlets heading off into the Mediterranean Sea. So very well watered area, very fertile area, even in Joseph's day. And so the people move down to land of Goshen. Basically, this is like prime real estate. If you were playing Monopoly, he just moved them to Boardwalk and built a hotel. Okay, if that translates for you. And so this was a big deal. They moved there. So they get to Egypt, and then time begins to progress as time does. And so a family that was about 70 people when they were started begins to grow. And then we read something interesting in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8. And that says, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, on the surface, that seems like, okay, well, there was another king. Kings live, kings die. That happens, right? You know, the king is dead. Long live the king, because that's how it rolls. We just go from one to the next. This verse actually indicates, though, probably a dynastic change. This also happened in Egypt many times over the years. There was a whole completely new dynasty that came to power, which makes a lot more sense when we think about it that way, because you know, if you were the Pharaoh who was there when Joseph saved Egypt, you know Joseph. In fact, you really know Joseph because Joseph essentially used that famine and that famine relief to buy the entire country. By the time that 7 years of famine was over, Pharaoh owned the people, he owned the cattle, he owned the land, he owned the gold, he owned the grain, and he got to give everybody a tax to let them just live. And so Joseph actually made Pharaoh incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, more than he already was. Everybody in Pharaoh's family knew Joseph and owed Joseph a lot. Pharaoh's son would have known Joseph, and his grandson would have known Joseph. You bring in a whole new family, a whole new dynasty, a whole new king set coming in. They take over the land. They're not beholden to Joseph at all, because in their mind, now they have carved out this niche where they will be the ruling family of Egypt. And so this verse really speaks more to a dynastic change than just the death of one king and the birth of, or the ascendance of another. And so you get a new Pharaoh and really a new dynasty taking place. And this new Pharaoh, as he comes into the country and as he assesses this kingdom that he has just carved out for himself, begins to look at the landscape of what's around him, begins doing demographic analyses and all these kinds of things that politically minded people do. And he looks around and he realizes that he has either a problem or an opportunity. He looks around and he sees that there is this huge group of people who seem to be, maybe on the take more than they should be, who don't seem to be Egyptian, and do seem to be somebody that could be a problem. And so Pharaoh recognizes this, and we find it in verse 9 as he continues on. He said to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." The Israelites were reproducing faster than the Egyptians, and they were in a fertile area to begin with, and so they were becoming a very large people group within the nation of Egypt. And he was looking around and was like, wow, this could be a problem. There's more of them than of us. So he says in verse 10, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." So this Pharaoh had a great plan. He was going to enslave the Hebrews. Now his thinking, his reasons for doing this are stated right here. First of all, so they wouldn't multiply out of control. That was his primary goal. He didn't want them to become so many that they could completely overpower the Egyptians. He just got this kingdom. He wasn't in a hurry to lose it. And so his first goal was so they wouldn't multiply out of control. Add to that, he didn't want them to fight against him or against them, the Egyptians. And then he didn't want them to leave. Because here it posed this great opportunity. We've got these people. They are many. They can do many great tasks for us. We don't want them to leave. We want to enslave them, and we want to keep them. And that was his goal. And so they started off on this program, this plan rather, of enslaving the Israelites. Now, if we were to keep reading, here's what we find. And do you remember what his primary goal was? His primary goal was to keep them from multiplying out of control. And here's what they found was great success with this plan. As soon as they enslaved them, they started multiplying more. Maybe this should have been a tip that this is not a great plan, but it was his plan. And so he's doubled down on the plan, and they begin to add more burdens and more tasks and more difficulty to the life of the Hebrew slaves. And guess what happened? They begin to multiply even faster. I mean, they were regular rabbits over there. So Pharaoh's plan isn't really going according to plan. And so Pharaoh started a new program because they went from multiplying to multiplying exponentially, and the more we give them, the more they multiply. And this doesn't make sense. We're not sure what they're doing with all their time, but we're going to fix this. And so he starts a new program that is essentially population control. And that's all there is to it. He makes a decree, he gives a decree, and he hands it to the midwives who were responsible for helping the Hebrew women birth their children. And the decree was simply this: if there is a female child that's born, let it live. If it's a male child, kill it. Very draconian, very, not very caring. Also kind of backwards historically. Most of the time you get population control, it goes the other way around. You let the boys live because they're stronger and they can do more for slave labor, and you kill the girls. So it's just kind of backwards. Pharaoh's thinking was a little bit backwards all the way around. But that was his plan. Kill the boys, let the girls live. The midwives who were responsible for carrying out this plan decided they didn't like it, and so they didn't follow it. In fact, they straight up lied right to his face about it. But that was the deal. They weren't going to do it. So Pharaoh decided that this is still the plan that we need to have, and so he altered the decree, and he gave it to the responsibility to the parents. And he says, look, if you have a male child, then you are to throw that child in the Nile River. If you have a female child, she can live. It's still backward. It's still stupid. It's still incredibly mean, vicious, but that's the plan. And so under pains of penalty of death, now parents are confronted with this option of, when we have a child, if it's a female, we can keep her, and if it's a boy, we have to throw it in the river. What a great setting that Pharaoh is creating. Because that definitely, one, it controls population, and it makes people love you more when you do that, right? Not exactly. So that's the plan. Then we get to Exodus chapter 2, and we're introduced, the plan kind of focuses in on a couple of specific people. We find Moses' parents get together and have a baby. People do that. At Exodus chapter 2, and a man of the house of Levi went and took his wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. Now here's a couple things. First of all, when you read this, it's just a straight up reading, you're going to think that Moses was their firstborn son, right? Makes sense? You read those verses, you're like, Moses is their first child. Moses is not their first child. This has happened to us a few other times as we've been reading through these older books of the Bible, that the story is focused around a large central figure, not necessarily the order of birth. What we would find, if we were to continue reading, and you should, is that Moses actually has a brother named Aaron. Remember him? Some of you have been around church and the Bible long enough. You remember Aaron became the first high priest of Israel. Aaron was actually 3 years older than Moses, and Aaron had a sister who was even older than him, though I don't know how old she was off the top of our heads. We don't know that. But she was several years older than Aaron, and so Moses was actually the baby of the family. But the story, you think Bible-wise, you get Abraham as this really big central figure. Moses is this really big central figure. And so the story focuses immediately on him, not on everything else, because you're in a rush to get to this big central figure. You figure, who wrote the book of Exodus? Moses, it turns out. So, yeah, he was in a hurry to get to, this is my story, we're going to get here. I don't know if that's how it went, but, it could have. And so Moses is born, and you have these. Now, we're told here that Moses was a beautiful child. I looked at it across a bunch of different translations, and some of them say beautiful, some of them say fine, some of them say special, some of them say goodly. You get the idea that Moses was a beautiful baby. But let's face it, parents, can we just talk a second here? How many of your babies were beautiful babies? All of them. Have you ever seen an ugly baby? Now, truth be told, the answer is yes, you have. Because you and I both know that when I'm looking at your baby, I'm not thinking the same things I'm looking at when I'm thinking of mine. I look at my babies and I'm like, they're all beautiful people. I love to look at the baby pictures, like, oh, they're so cute. And now even that they're entering in their teenage years and progressing through their teenage years, I'm looking at them like, man, my kids are good-looking kids. Like, I don't know what happened to everybody else on planet Earth, but my kids are good-looking. Not sure how that happened or where that came from, because God didn't have much to work with. But they're great-looking kids. Everybody else's kids are little jacked up, man. I don't know. So the answer is yes, you've seen ugly babies, but they weren't yours. And so I don't know. On the surface, you're thinking, okay, here's Moses' mom and their dad, and he's the baby of the family, and that's always bad. You're like, oh, what a beautiful baby. Well, of course he's a beautiful baby. He's your baby. But we get the idea, and we're going to come back to this in the book of Hebrews and talk about it a little bit more. We get the idea that there may have been something just that much extra special, something just slightly different enough that this was unusual. Because you think, Aaron was only 3 years old. I mean, it's like, oh, we got baby Mo and we got Aaron. Aaron's not that old exactly. I mean, 3-year-olds are still pretty cute most of the time. They haven't quite gotten obnoxious yet. I would never say that about a child, really. Oh, I just did. Never mind. But still, I mean, Aaron was right there. You saying that Aaron was ugly? I don't think they were. I think there was something extra special about Moses. Like I said, we'll come back to that, look at it in Hebrews 11. But so we get this, and we find Moses was a beautiful baby, and then we find Moses actually was placed in the river. Now, here's the thing. Moses' parents actually obeyed the king's decree. Look in verse 3. But when she could no longer hide him, so apparently Moses was a bit of a crier, and 3 months was as long as she could control him. About 4 months, kids get vocal cords that are robust. And sometimes more bust than row. I'm not sure. But they get robust, and especially if they get backwards, they start screaming through the night and sleeping through the day. We've never had that happen around here, Bells. Sometimes it happens, but they could no longer hide him. So when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. So, did she obey the king's command? Yeah, the king's command was you have to put the baby in the river. She put the baby in the river. Now, the king didn't say you couldn't build a boat. He said you had to put him in. She put him in the river. Waterproof boat, with a blanket and, a bottle and a little thing hanging over top and, all those kinds of things, I'm sure. But they obeyed. Now, so she put her baby in the river. She just so happened. And I don't think this is happenstance. And if you've seen that movie, Prince of Egypt, where she puts the baby in the river and he goes whisking through like all of the perils of the Nile River, it didn't happen that way. It was wonderfully dramatic, and I love the scene where they walk through and are playing with the water as the Red Sea was parted and you can see the whales swim by. I think that was cool as anything. But this scene, not so much. I know it's an old movie for some of us, but anyway. So she lays this ark, this little boat, in the bulrushes. Now, bulrushes grow with calm water, not raging rapids. Not much grows in raging rapids. But around the edges where the water is calm, bulrushes grow up, and so she put the baby in there, and it just so happened to be an area where Pharaoh's daughter would come and bathe. Now, how many of you think that was accidental? No takers on that? Yeah, just coincidence. I'm going to stick them here. I hope for the best. Not on your life. Not on his life either. She was doing everything she could to protect his life. And so she put him in the bulrushes, obeying Pharaoh's command, in a place where Pharaoh's daughter might find him. And soon enough, Pharaoh's daughter did find him. In fact, he wasn't there very long, which tells me she didn't only pick the place, she picked the time. And Miriam, his older sister, just happened to be standing there watching to see what would happen. She didn't leave anything to chance. And Pharaoh's daughter sees the little ark there, sends one of her servants to get it, and they bring it, and they find that there's this cute little baby. A slave baby, but cute baby nonetheless. Actually, a beautiful baby. And there's something in Moses' person, even at 3 months old, something in his inherent beauty, even at 3 months old, that makes Pharaoh's daughter go, I want this child. Like, this one's too cute to let it die. Too cute to let it go. And so she drew him up out of the water, and Miriam instantly pops in, sprung right into action. Hey, I can find you a Hebrew woman who will nurse this child for you, and then, once it's weaned, give it to you. How does that work? And Pharaoh's daughter was like, well, okay. So this is very coincidental that Miriam was able to go get her mom, and her mom was able to take care of Moses under the the protection of Pharaoh and under the wages of Pharaoh. So now she was not only being mom to Moses, she was actually physically, literally getting paid to be mom to Moses. How many of you moms wish mom came with a paycheck? Because the amount of overtime you get is insane, right? Moses' mom actually was getting a paycheck. That's not a bad deal. And so we have this, that Moses was actually placed in the river as instructed. We find that in verse 10. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she, Pharaoh's daughter, called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. And so that's kind of the backstory that we get. So now we want to jump back to Hebrews chapter 11, because that really ends the narrative here, the story. Now we can kind of process this. Hebrews chapter 11, let's read it again. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. Now there are two related reasons that Moses' parents are here included in this Faith Hall of Fame. Two related things that they did that was just an incredible demonstration of faith. Now, what is faith? Faith is believing God, right? That's our running definition through the series. Really, it's just a definition that you could use anytime. Faith is believing God. They believed God, and it manifested in action, in two specific related actions that got them included here into the Faith Hall of Fame. Now, the first of those actions was they recognized Moses' specialness. They recognized Moses' specialness. They hid Moses, and they saw that Moses was beautiful. We find this word again here in Hebrews chapter 11, that he was beautiful. Everything seems to hinge on that word. Are you getting the sense of this? That everything in their action, everything in their reaction, everything about their inclusion here in Hebrews chapter 11, really even the story in Exodus chapter 1 and 2, everything seems to hinge on this idea that he was beautiful. So that becomes key to understanding what that means. And I'll give you this, it's a tough one. When we look at the word in Hebrew from Exodus, what we find is that it's just a general word for good. It literally is used over 500 times in the Old Testament. It doesn't stand out as being exceptional, and so that really doesn't help us a lot. The Greek in the New Testament is actually a little bit more instructive, and so the author of Hebrews reaches out to this, and here's what we end up with. The word that's translated here, beautiful, was a word that was used primarily of that which befitted the town or town-born, and Greek writers would use it in contrast to a word that we would translate as rustic or hick, hillbilly, kind of an idea. And it's actually, this word is the only place it's found in the New Testament is right here in description of Moses, which makes it a lot more instructive. And so the idea is when you looked at Moses, that there was something special about him that made him, even as an infant, appear as though he were highborn. Whatever highborn might mean to you, that's what it meant. In his day, it meant that physically he looked more like Egyptian nobility than he looked like a slave baby. Which is an interesting occurrence. It's not something, parents, as much as we'd like to control what our kids look like, we'd mess that up if we were choosing. And thankful that God does it. But in Moses' day, there was no even hope of it. Whatever had happened there was the result of what God had done to Moses in his development in the womb. But Moses coming out looked more like Egyptian nobility than he did like a Hebrew child, like an ordinary Hebrew baby. And so when Moses' mother looks at him, she goes, wow, this is a beautiful baby. There's something extra special about this baby. He doesn't look like all the other Hebrew kids running around. And when Pharaoh's daughter looks at him, why was Pharaoh's daughter in a position to need to adopt a child? We can only assume that she was childless, and that's the reason. But she looks at this baby and she goes, this looks like a noble-born Egyptian, not like a Hebrew slave child, though she knew what it was. And so when we when we see here that Moses was described in both the Old Testament and the New Testament as being beautiful, understand this is bigger than just beauty. This is a physical birthright that exceeds his actual station. And his parents recognized that there was something more polished, something different about Moses than just the average. And so they weren't willing to just, crush this in compliance with Pharaoh's really horrible command. And so his parents recognized his specialness. Secondly, they recognized God's sovereignty. They were not afraid, we're told, of Pharaoh and his decree and the penalty that it carried. That in recognizing Moses' specialness, in recognizing what God was clearly doing in the life of their infant newborn son, they also recognized that this is God's sovereignty, that God is doing something, and that something is more important than whatever Pharaoh's got going on. Whatever new population control measures he's taking, whatever new draconian plans he's unveiling, whatever God is doing is far more important. They recognized that God's command was more important than the king's command, that God's plan was more important than the king's plan. Now, I'll grant you that all seems a little bit esoteric. That's, instructive, but where is the application? I think the application comes actually in Jesus' own words. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, important words to us, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you." Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Part of seeking God's kingdom is recognizing what God is doing. Moses' parents recognized that God was doing something. They didn't even understand what, but they did recognize when they saw that this was different, this was unique, this was special, this was the hand of God. It means recognizing what God is doing is a big part of seeking God's kingdom, and then recognizing God's sovereignty over anything else is the other piece of that. And Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things, all the other things that we usually clamor for, they'll be added to you. You see, Moses' parents, the faith that they had was simply the faith to seek. They were looking for what God was doing. And they were focused on what God was doing, even to the exclusion of what powerful men wanted to do. They were looking for what God was doing, even in spite of the penalty that they might face in the process. They weren't worried about the things that what most people were worried about. You figure most of us, what are we worried about? We're worried about what we're going to eat, what we're going to wear, where we're going to work, where we're going to live, right? And not necessarily in that order. It's approaching noon. Most of you are focused on what you're going to eat, right? Yes, no, yeah. Hopefully by now you know not to put anything in the oven with a timer on it. But that's where our focus is. It's how much money can I acquire? How much power can I acquire? What fancy things can I acquire? And these are my focus. It's building my kingdom. Jesus said if we'll seek his kingdom, that all that stuff we're looking for, he said that'll be added to you. You'll get that. But to God, that's really not important. What's important is his kingdom. Moses' parents demonstrated the faith to seek. They sought God's kingdom, not their own. They sought God's kingdom, not Pharaoh's. Part of that seeking was recognizing what God was doing. The other part of that seeking was recognizing God's sovereignty. So they sought God and his kingdom. You say it seemed pretty ordinary by and large because, you think about it as a parent, is it not your absolute instinct to save your children's lives? What lengths do parents go through to save their children? If one of my kids was sick, I would do anything. I would go anywhere. I would sacrifice everything for them. And so would you. That's our instinct as parents, is to protect and preserve the life of my child. So we look at it and we're like, okay, so Moses' parents just proved to be normal parents. Didn't seem like that big a stretch. And yet, in their time, in their place, that was an absolute act of faith. To recognize what God was doing, to recognize God's sovereignty, and to pursue it as much as they could. So here's the question for us. In the just normal happenstances of life, do we recognize what God is doing in our lives? You say, God's not doing anything in my life. Well, that means you're dead. And since this isn't a funeral, I'm thinking you're not, which means He is. As long as you're alive, He's doing something in your life. For some of you, He's trying to direct you into a relationship with Himself. He presents Jesus before you and says, just believe that Jesus died on the cross in your place for your sins. Come into relationship with me. And everything He's doing in your life is to gear you, direct you to that. Many of us have already made that decision. We are already in relationship with God, and God is doing everything He can to make us more like Jesus, which is great. But God is always moving, always active in our lives. The question is, what is God doing in your life? Do you even know? Some of us float downstream like dead fish, and we have no idea. We're just not paying attention. We're so focused on what I'm going to eat today, what I'm going to wear today, how much money I can get, and how much stuff I can get, that we never look around to see what God is doing in our lives. That we never even ask the question, God, what do you want me to do? You know, forget, ask not what your country can do for you. How about ask not what your God can do for you? Ask what you can do for Him. It's a great line. I'll steal it. What is God doing in your life? Do you even recognize the specialness of your life and your situation? And then do you recognize the sovereignty of God to pursue that more fiercely than you pursue the other stuff in your kingdom, somebody else's kingdom? Do we have the faith to seek? It's going to look very mundane to everybody else. But in your life, it will be special. It will be powerful. It will be different, even if you're the only one that knows it, than everyone else around. Do you have the faith to seek? Father, we love you. I thank you for Moses' parents. Lord, not the least of which is they ensured that Moses lived, and we owe them a lot to your word because of it. But Father, we see in them a fantastic demonstration of faith. What it looks like. From the outside looking in, it may not even look that special, like parents just being parents. And yet they knew what they were doing was special. They recognized your hand in their lives. They recognized your sovereignty, and they pursued your kingdom passionately. More than their own kingdom, more than Pharaoh's kingdom. They pursued yours. Father, would you help us to have the faith to seek? Would you help us to believe you enough to trust that you're doing something in our lives, to find it, and then to follow it, knowing that's what makes our life unique, different, better. Father, for those who you are still trying to draw into relationship with yourself, I especially pray for them this morning. Father, would you help them to recognize that you just want to be in relationship with them, that you sent your Son to die for them. Would you help them to get into the place where they would say, today's the day I say yes. I enter this relationship with God. I accept Jesus as my Savior. Father, I pray especially for them. Would you draw them to yourself? And then, Father, for the rest of us, would you open our eyes to the world that's around us, to what you're doing in our lives, so that we can seek you above all else, we pray in Jesus' good name.